somebody has already asked me here, what was here before Salus? And the answer was not damn much. Because, you see, if I go back in psychiatric history a bit, until the 1950s, there was really no effective treatment for severe mental illness. And the result of that was that most of the treatment of severe and persistent mental illness was in the provincial mental hospitals, where people went and sometimes stayed for many years. But around 1955, the first effective antipsychotic drugs became available. And that made a big change in psychiatric practice. The introduction of more effective drugs meant that it became possible for the treatment of severe illness to be shifted to the communities where people lived, away from the provincial mental hospitals. And this led to the founding of psychiatric units in many of the general hospitals. I think the first one to be founded was at the Ottawa General, and then the Civic, and then a few years later, the Royal Ottawa Sanatorium, as it was then, became the Royal Ottawa Hospital as a community psychiatric hospital. But there was very little in the community for people. I mean, many chronically mentally or persistently mentally ill people were able to live with their families. But if they couldn't, there was very little available. There were a number of boarding homes where people were housed and given food and so forth. But there were really, and there were also rooming houses and very few other facilities, but there really were no community-based rehabilitation programs. But in 1975, the Ministry of Health and the province of Ontario began to recognize the problem. And so they awarded $1 million to the Ministry of Health to support community initiatives to start supportive programs for mentally ill people in the community. And that resulted in the local branch of the Canadian Mental Health Association set up a committee to look into the needs of the community. And I think, Jacqueline, you were a member of that committee, as I recall.
Elizabeth Moran. Remember Elizabeth Moran?
Yeah, I was going to say, I got a call from Elizabeth Moran, who was the executive director, and she asked me if I would become a member of this committee to look into this. And I was already aware of the severe problems that many of my patients who were facing in the community. There were people in boarding homes and rooming houses and so on, and there was very little support for them outside of, I mean, those who were in families had some support, but other than that, there was very little. And so we spent much of 75 and 76 trying to decide what we should do and arguing back and forth. Was supportive housing the most important thing, or community rehabilitation program? Finally, we said, doesn't matter a damn what we do, we got to do something. So those of us who were interested in supporting the development of supportive housing formed a group, and we decided to pursue an incorporation. Now our member, the president of the group was George Windsor. He was a lawyer with Gowling and Henderson. So he was tasked with the job of getting us an incorporation. And I think our original board of directors had, I think, 3 psychiatrists and about 4 or 5 social workers who were interested in this. And then the rest were people like Jacqueline, who were members of the community who had experience and interest in supporting the development of this type of project. Now, somebody has asked me, how did Salus get its name? Well, we had picked out a variety of names, like the Ottawa Supportive Housing Coalition or something. Anyway, we discovered when George talked to the people in the provincial government who were responsible for incorporating things. At that time, you had to have a name for an organization. Now, I don't think you do anymore. You can have a number. But in those days, you had to have a name. So we had a whole bunch of names, and he went through the list, and they all said, no, that won't work. It's too close to some other organization. It could be confusion. So he reached back to his schoolboy Latin. Salus means health in Latin. So he said, how about Ottawa Salus Corporation? And they said, that's fine, that's good. So that's how we became Ottawa Salus Corporation. And shortly after we got our incorporation with Ottawa Salus, we started getting mail. And one letter I remember came from directed to the Ottawa Sales Corporation. And another one, which was quite inappropriate, was the Ottawa Say Less Corporation. So anyway, once we had our incorporation, we spent probably much of 80 looking for a property that we could buy. And we had a real estate agent who made us aware that there was a rooming house at 622 Cooper Street, which was up for sale. The thing was, it had been operated as a rooming house for some years, but the owner had had a heart attack and couldn't continue, so he put the property up for sale. Now, there were 2 mortgages on the property, so we made an application to the Ministry of Health. We also made an application to Canada Mortgage and Housing, which at that time had a mandate for supporting social housing. And so we made these 2 applications, and we made a conditional offer to purchase the property at 622 Cooper Street based on if we got funding from Canada Mortgage and Housing and from the Ministry of Health. So much of 1980, we went back and forth and back and forth. Canada Mortgage and Housing said, yes, they liked the project, but they wouldn't fund us unless we had a guarantee from the Ministry of Health that they would do their part. And the Ministry of Health, although they had $1 million to spend, couldn't make up their mind what to do. They didn't know, they had no clue what they should be using it for. So we went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, towards the middle or end of 1980, I guess, we got word from the real estate agent that the holder of the second mortgage was fed up. He hadn't been paid anything for months. So he was preparing to foreclose on the property. And this was, of course, putting the whole thing under severe threat. I mean, the whole project could go down the tubes if we didn't get some money. So by this time, I had put sufficient effort in that I was determined that I wasn't going to let go. So I spoke to the board and said I was prepared to back a bank loan for enough money to pay off the second mortgage. It wasn't a huge amount. It was something like $10,000. So I said I would back that. To my surprise, 2 other board members stepped up and said, well, we agree, and we'll join you. So George Windsor, who was the president, and Frank McKim, who was another board member, and I backed a bank loan. We got the money, we paid off the mortgage, and at that point, another surprise, Canada Mortgage and Housing said, well, I guess you guys are pretty serious. If you are prepared to put your own money behind this, then maybe we can sort of waive this condition that you get funding from the Ministry of Health. So that's what happened. They then approved our mortgage to complete the purchase of the property and to do all the necessary renovations to bring it up to all the appropriate health and safety standards. So we were then able to hire a firm to do this, but we had no money to pay staff. At this point, to again, another happy surprise, a member of our board, Sister Irene Despard, who was a member of the Sisters of Charity, had said to us that she was prepared. She had come to a point in her life where she had decided she didn't need to be a nun anymore. And she said she would be willing to work for us. But I said, Irene, we have no money to pay you. And she said, yes, but I'm sure you're going to get the money. So we did finally get approval from the Ministry of Health that they would fund us to hire staff. Well, even though the approval was given in August of '79, it actually took until January of 1980 before the money started flowing. So anyway, in 1980, we were able, sort of January of 1980, we had enough money in retroactive payments and so on that we were able to pay Irene for the work she had done for the previous 7 or 8 months, and we were able to hire relief staff to, so that she could have weekends and days off during the week. So that was how we got started. Well, interestingly, within about 4 weeks of us getting the funding from the Ministry of Health, we started getting calls from all over the province, from other projects that were supposed to be starting. And they said, the Ministry of Health is advising us to come down and see what you're doing. So we said, okay, that's fine. So we had people visiting from all these other areas of the province. So I finally rang up the contact I had with the Ministry of Health and said, look, what's going on here? You're sending all these people to it. And they said, well, to tell you the truth, Dr. Catterson, you're the only game in town. You're the only province, you're the only organization that we have funded from our allocation, which is actually up and running. So we're sending them all down to see what you're doing because you're doing something. And so that's the story of how it got started. Now, within, that the first house at 622 Cooper Street is still, I guess, a Salus property. It was the first property. A couple of years after that, we were able to buy, with the help of the government, the house on Crichton Street. And then the third property was the building on Fisher Avenue. And that was the first one that we actually designed and built ourselves. It wasn't a vacant lot. There was an old house on it that was decrepit. So we were able to buy the lot, destroy the house, or just demolish it and build a house to our own specifications. So those were our first 3 properties. So it's gone on from there. And I guess I don't need to talk longer about this. But the one thing, if I could get a little personal, is, I graduated in medical school in 1956. I started my psychiatric training in 1957. And I retired in 2017. So I was engaged in psychiatric practice altogether for 60 years. Now, I always enjoyed my work. It wasn't always easy, but I always felt some satisfaction. But working as a psychiatrist, you were working with individuals or families, trying to help them to improve their way of life, to have a happier life, and so on. But with Salus, I felt this is the one thing that I've done which not only helped individuals, but I think that Ottawa is a better place today because of Salus. And that gives me enormous satisfaction. I really think that, I've gotten, that knowledge has given me much more back from anything that I ever contributed. It makes me feel as though we did something to make Ottawa a better community. Anyway, thank you very much.
That was amazing.